friends! So today I just wanted to talk about some of my all-time favorite classics. So I know this is not a genre that a lot of people read, but I do like to read classic literature. I like to read some classic literature, I should say, because I like to read different kinds of diverse classic literature out there. I've been trying to get more into reading classic literature from people of color, and I like to read classic literature written by women and not so many of the old stuffy ones written by men. I mean, I'll read some of those too, of course, but I don't just like anything that's classic literature. I have very particular tastes. So these are just some of my personal recommendations, and I'd love to hear some of yours if you have some to share. So the first book I want to talk about is Anne of Green Gables. Now, I did mention that I have read some of the books that follow this one in the series, and I did mention in my wrap-up that I did not really love the sequels to this, but I did love the first book a lot. It is super whimsical and has a very active imagination, and it reminds me a lot of myself as a little kid. I had a super active imagination when I was a child, and this book just took me back to that. It really got me back in that feeling of childhood, and that whimsy was beautiful. And this edition is also gorgeous, by the way. It is a Puffin and Bloom book, and it came with the set. But I love just the whimsy and the free-spiritedness of the story and all of the things that Anne makes up with her imagination, and that's why it will always be one of my all-time favorite classics. So the next book I wanted to mention is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and this is a very different kind of vibe from the other book that I just mentioned. This is super interesting. It is about this scientist named Frankenstein who ends up developing this monster, but this monster is sentient and has feelings, and he's like trying to destroy it and all of these things because he realizes he can't control it. So it is about autonomy, about figuring out who has, the right to be treated fairly, and makes us question how we treat animals, how we treat other people, and I think that's really interesting. It is a gothic horror kind of vibe, like something that captured my attention. I don't read a lot of gothic fiction or gothic horror or horror in general, so I liked diving into this one. It was really good, it was really fascinating, and I read it around Halloween time, which is when I recommend that you should read it. But this is a new edition that I got of it from Barnes & Noble. I love this edition, and I love Mary Shelley's writing. She wrote an absolute masterpiece with this book. So the next book I wanted to mention, I have mentioned before, but it is Animal Farm by George Orwell. And this book follows these animals living on this farm, and they kind of observe human behavior, and they realize how the humans are interacting. And so these animals start interacting with each other in a similar kind of way. And it is really interesting because they kind of set up a hierarchy of the animals too, and it kind of follows hierarchies based off of things that they've seen people do, so that's really curious. And it is a big discussion about politics, about how people should arrange themselves in government and all of that, and so I think that's really interesting. It has a lot of discussions about communism, about democracy, about what kind of government is best, and I think this is very important. It's one that I want to reread soon, and I think that everyone should read this. George Orwell writes really poignant fiction that is very relevant even today, and I think you should read it if you haven't picked it up. Speaking of George Orwell, the next book that I have to mention is 1984, and this book I don't have a physical copy of, but I did read it in school a number of years ago, and I really was astounded by it. It has all these predictions about what life would look like in 1984, and while it didn't happen in 1984, I feel like a lot of things that happened in that book then are happening now. There is a lot of discussion of government control, and it's got that similar kind of political themes that Animal Farm has, but it's more about governmental control, how much say the government should have, the party system, and all of that, and the discussions that we need to be having about that, and the thought police and all of that. So it's really interesting. I get super scared of things like AI and all of that, especially after reading this book, because of the thought police and how they ended up controlling every aspect of everyone's lives. Like, that is super crazy to me, and something that I think is currently happening, and just the book banning and things like that are very scary things that are happening that I think are highlighted in this book. So if you haven't read this, I think you definitely should. It is a very chilling read, so just know that going into it, because there are some things that you will find resonates with us now. If you read only one of George Orwell's books, I recommend picking up 1984. On a more positive note, the next book I have to mention is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So I don't have an individual copy of it, but I do have it in this bound edition with all of the novels from Jane Austen, but it is such a light, beautiful read. If you read something like 1984 or Frankenstein and you need something just more lighthearted, more romantic, I recommend Pride and Prejudice. It is such a beautiful story, and it does have some social commentary as well. Jane Austen is the queen of writing social commentary. I love how she kind of pokes fun at her characters and at her society, and it is historical fiction now, but at the time it was contemporary. So I think it's interesting to see how her writing compares to historical fiction writing of now, because she views and writes about the people in a very different kind of way. But she is very romantic. She has this ability to make this longing and yearning between her characters, which is beautiful and stunning, and I love the characters from it. I like that we get this kind of family that's a little bit more uncouth, with some of the Bennet family members being a little more uncouth. And then we have Mr. Darcy, who's very aloof, and Mr. Bingley, who's just like the cutest golden retriever boy you've ever met. But it's very beautiful. I highly recommend it, and I think that you should read it if you have not. And if you just want to watch the movies, that's okay too. I like them a lot. I like the 1990s BBC miniseries more than the 2005 movie, but the 2005 movie does the story justice too, I think. The next classic that I want to mention is The Great Gatsby. Now, this one is set in the 1920s, so it is a more recent kind of book. It has recently turned 100 years old, which is crazy. It's like 103, 104 years old now. But I recommend that you read it. It is about these people who are living in the roaring 20s and living that fun, fast lifestyle. And there's a lot of lavish parties in it. But it's not just pointing that out, it's pointing out some of the things that they're covering up with these parties, like the kind of ways that there's all these things happening that are building up to the Great Depression that ends up happening in the 30s, and just the things that the parties are masking. So I think that's really important, and I think it's interesting because you get more of a look into the inner lives of these people that are leading these lives that you think are perfect and ideal, but they're not. So that's why I really love The Great Gatsby. I am also due for a reread of this, but I absolutely love it, and I think that it's one that you should read if you're interested in the 1920s and that timeline, and interested in stories that are about like this facade of trying to pretend to be perfect versus who you really are, and all the struggles that you are hiding beneath all of that. All right, so the next book that I have to talk about is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I feel like I butchered that author's last name, and I'm so sorry. But it is originally written in French. It is translated into English and Spanish and a bunch of other languages too. And I love the story. It is about this young prince that travels to the earth from another world. And it is about like this journey of self-discovery, of interacting with the world and figuring out how things behave around them, and just trying to make true connection. I love that the story is just so beautiful. The illustrations are lovely, and you really get the sense of like homeliness, of trying to make connection, of just love, and how children view the world differently from adults. They view the world with such wonder and such beauty in their eyes. Like, I love that it captures that childhood essence of being awed by everything in the world, and I think that is absolutely beautiful, and I definitely recommend it. It's a super short read, so it doesn't take too long to get into it or to finish it, but it's a beautiful book, and I highly recommend it if you have not read it yet. All right, so the last book that I have to mention is The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. Now, this book is a Russian classic literature book. It is really interesting though, because you get to see this high-ranking official as he's basically on his deathbed. He has this chronic terminal illness, and he's dying, and he's doing a lot of self-reflection. So the book is a lot about his self-reflection, of reflecting on what he's done with his life and the things that he hasn't. And I think it's really interesting how he regrets a lot of things about his life, and because he was so busy striving for all these things that society told him he should be, he wasn't ever really happy or content in his life. So I think it's an important read, because I think it makes you reflect on your own life, and if you're doing the things that truly make you happy or truly give you a sense of fulfillment. So I think that for that reason alone, it's very important, but it has that moral issue of coming to terms with death as well, and our mortality, and trying to make the most of every day that we have. So I think that this is a beautiful book that is an absolute masterpiece, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's another one that's not too long either, so it shouldn't take too long. I know it is a little bit more complicated to read with some of the language in it, but it is one that I definitely recommend regardless. So those are all of my favorite classics to this point. There will likely be more as I read more classics, but what are some of your favorite classics? I'd love to know if you can share it down below. I'd love to hear them and maybe check them out myself. If you are new to the genre, these are some ones that I recommend that you check out. But if you haven't read classics, let me know why down below. And if you're interested in getting into the genre, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like this video, give it a like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you for the next one. Thank you so much. Have a good day wherever you are in the world. And I hope to see you in the next video.